Am I too close, sir? Okay. Thank you. Thank you. The story recounts the King Philip War from the viewpoint of a Wampanoag warrior. I read it and loved it, and I noticed that the author lived in the next town, Franklin, Massachusetts, and I noticed that he had already published 3 other books. At that time, our son was a member of the Cub Scout group, and I suggested, why don't we invite Michael Tougias to come speak to the whole troop? Mainly because much of the King Philip War took place in the land that is now Franklin and Norfolk. So Michael came, he showed the boys arrowheads used by the local Native Americans, and arrows and bows made out of animal bone and sinew, and paintings of King Philip and what he might have looked like and how he dressed. Well, the boys loved it. And then Michael invited questions. So I raised my hand. Mr. Tougias, I said, I know you have a full-time job, a family, a home, a mortgage to pay. How do you find the time to write books? And he answered, I have stopped watching TV. In the 28 years since then, Michael has published more than 30 books. Many of them are tales of disaster at sea and the daring rescues performed by others. I think many of us know The Finest Hour, co-written by Casey Sherman, another Tales favorite, and which became a Disney movie in 2016. Now, if you have read 10 Hours Until Dawn, tonight's book, you know that Michael is a consummate researcher and a straightforward but passionate storyteller. He brings energy and excitement to his stories, and he enthralls the readers. Michael has made an entire career out of his research and writing skills and his presentation skills. I would say that over the years, Michael has presented to school groups and business groups and library groups. And my husband Arthur and I, we have listened as Michael spoke to our son's middle school and at Hyannis Yacht Club and here at Tales and at small town libraries in Massachusetts and Rhode Island and in Naples, Florida. So I think that makes us Michael Tougias groupies. Michael has also written 10 books for young children and middle readers. And I want to show you his newest book, Ochala, because I think it is this beautiful cover. The book is Ochala and the Pilgrims. This is a historical fiction about a 10-year-old Wampanoag boy who watches as the Mayflower first arrives in Plymouth Harbor. And yes, the story includes many of the historical figures who were so important during that first year. Massasoit, Samoset, Squanto, William Bradford. This is a beautiful children's introduction to the relationship between the Native Americans and the colonists and the importance of that relationship and its nuances. So, I would say, if I can go on. So may I remind you all that the holidays are coming, and if you have to shop for your grandchildren, you can start tonight. I am so proud to introduce Mr. Michael Tougias. Thank you, Michael, for being here.
Thank you for coming out. That great introduction. Now the pressure's on. Oh God. This story, I'll give you a little bit of background on how I got into this one, because this really did change my career. Up till then, most of my books were doing well in New England, but not countrywide. And then this book took off. But the way I came across the story was I was doing a book that included people's photos from the blizzard of '78. And in the Boston Globe was a very tiny article, "The pilot boat Can Do is missing." And then in the article, they said, they quoted from the captain during the storm out at sea. And I'm like, well, if the boat's missing, how do they know what the captain said? And then I thought, whoa, maybe somebody made an audio tape of all the messages back and forth. So it was interesting. I worried about calling the captain's son, because it's a sensitive topic. But I did, and he surprised me by saying, boy, just yesterday I went to a bookstore saying, do you know of any local authors who would be interested in a story about my father? So it was meant to be. And he turned over 10 hours of audio tapes. So there's no speculation in this book. They're telling you hour by hour what's happening at sea during the blizzard of '78. And then, so we also did with Macmillan, a different publisher, we did a kids' version of the same story. So this is for middle readers, roughly age 9 to 15 or 16. And, but it has a different title. It's called Into the Blizzard. So same story, but written for a little bit younger audience. We've got 2 bookstores set up here. We've got Titcomb selling 10 Hours Until Dawn, and then I've brought all the other books. So, doing the books for children, I met a wonderful editor, Christy Ottaviano. She was with Macmillan, then I followed her to Little Brown. And that was never part of, quote, the plan as an author to write kids' books, but we made such a good team that I stayed with it, and we've done 10 books together now. And then on my own, because she wanted to focus on nonfiction, because as she said, kids are reading too much about vampires, goblins, wizards. We need real heroes. But so on my own, we did, with a different publisher, the story of the Native American observing what was happening with the Pilgrims. And then I needed something a little lighter. So this is a takeoff on the book Jaws, only it's called Claws. So this is for kids, middle readers, and it's about a giant lobster off an island in Maine. But it's based on one of the survivors I worked with from Fatal Forecast. Some people here just had that book in their book club. He showed me at his house a lobster claw, just the claw, not the leg, just the claw, 20 inches across. I was like, how big was the lobster? He goes, we don't know, because only the claw could fit in the trap. And when we pulled the trap up, so he estimated it to be 4 to 5 feet. So I made the lobster in the book 7 feet. And then finally, a local story. This is a relatively new book, The Power of Positive Fishing. And it's a Cape Cod story, 30 years on the ocean with one good friend, Adam Gamble. And you might recognize the name Adam Gamble because he started on Cape Publications, a lot of regional books, but then he got this great idea. We hatched it out on the boat together, Goodnight Cape Cod. And the book did so well that he went all in. He mortgaged his house, he maxed his credit cards, he did whatever it took to start this Goodnight series. And now it's been, probably 15 years later, he sold 10 million books. It's incredible. So The Power of Positive Fishing, the subtitle is A Story of Friendship and a Quest for Happiness. And it shows the two of us out there long before, the Finest Hours gave me the big boost and 10 Hours did, long before Goodnight Cape Cod, but we're brainstorming together. How can we make a living in this crazy business? And we go through life together, through divorce, illness, you name it. So although there's a lot of tips on catching striped bass, it's really a book about going through midlife and how one good friend can help you. So before I start the presentation, I do a newsletter every October, and if you'd like to get a copy, here's my little sign-up sheet. You can put your email. Here's for, I guess, this side of the room. Here's for this side of the room. So at the end of this presentation, I'll take questions or comments. It's really neat. There's somebody in the audience who knew these people involved. That's very unusual, too. And as I said earlier, you know, the audio tape spanned 10 hours, so that's where the title came from. So that the whole story takes place on the North Shore, from Gloucester down to Salem Sound. And the boat we're going to focus on was named the Can-Do. So, but this is, you know, it really doesn't go beyond this area. And the Can-Do was up there in Gloucester Harbor. And the night of the blizzard, by the way, it was in port at Gloucester. You know, Gloucester's a pretty safe harbor. That night it got hammered by the blizzard, but compared to the open ocean, that's a good place to be. So it wasn't as if the boat was out on the open ocean during the blizzard. It went out on the open ocean to save lives, and I'll explain how that happened. So I spent a lot of time up in Gloucester and would get out on different friends' boats. That's the big breakwater protecting the harbor. There, in the story, there's a Coast Guard vessel, a big one, 95-foot cutter, the Cape George, and I interviewed the 12 sailors on board, and they said, Mike, we think at the height of the blizzard, a big wave threw us up and over the breakwater. They said, because we just heard a terrible bang, and we went from 30, 35-foot seas to 6-foot seas. So they attribute their survival to luck. They didn't intend to go over the breakwater, but they think that's what happens. And back in 1978, Gloucester was more of a working seaport, so very active. Although Frank was not a fisherman. I'll explain his job. Frank's the lead character in the book. It's a great place to go up and walk around if you have a chance sometime. The Our Lady of Good Voyage Church. And then the Man at the Wheel statue. Very walkable town. And they had the names of the different fishing boats that have gone out and the crew members that have not come back over the years. And you'll see from the Perfect Storm, the men on that vessel. And you'll wonder, well, why isn't there anything about this whole Can-Do incident? And the reason is this monument is just to fishermen, and the Can-Do was a pilot boat. In other words, ferrying the pilot out to the big freighters and tankers coming into Gloucester. Coast Guard has a station right there in Gloucester Harbor, and that's going to play a real important role. Back then, they had all sorts of more mundane duties than today, where, you know, even if a boat was disabled, they'd bring it in, whereas today you have Towboat USA to bring you back. And here's the radio control room, and a good part of the book takes place in this one room, because the commander of that station, his name was Mike Paradis, and he's glued to the radios all night long, and it's all bad news coming in at him, and he's the one who's got to make a lot of these life and death decisions. So here's a painting of what the Can-Do looked like. Those rubber tires were to keep it from being metal on metal when it pulled up against a freighter. There's an earlier version of the Can-Do. I remember seeing this picture and going, oh, what a cool job. I'd love to work out on the ocean. But then I realized they do it during winter. They're going up that ladder in the ice. And if you fall, you're going to land between the Can-Do and the freighter and probably not make it. So Frank Quirk, there's two lead characters, Frank, and later you'll meet Charlie. Frank was the operator of this boat, and he would bring the pilots out to the vessels, and the pilot would take those big freighters and tankers into port. But Frank was well known in the Coast Guard circles because he often assisted them on missions. Today that wouldn't happen in today's Coast Guard, but back in 1978, it was pretty common for Frank to be involved. And here's one where he's receiving an award from the Coast Guard for his help during the rescue of the Chester Poling. And I thought that incident was so important, I made it, I think it was chapter 3 or 4 of the book, because it kind of foreshadows what's going to happen during the blizzard, and it shows that Frank was quite experienced with rescues. The Chester Poling was an oil tanker split in half in a winter storm off Gloucester, and 7 lives were at stake. And Frank, with the Coast Guard, went out, and they were able to rescue 6 out of the 7. And one coastie I interviewed, he was injured. He's being carried off the vessel here. You can see the can-do in the background of that picture. And he said, Mike, when we were going out, big wave hit us, threw me up against the ceiling, and when I came down on the floor, or the deck, I wondered who I landed on, because there was these pair of legs sticking out, and then he realized they were his legs. He had broken his back and had no feeling. But he said, over a period of 2 months, I slowly got feeling back in my legs and made a full recovery. He said when it first started, when the nerve endings first came back, he said the pain was excruciating. So you would think, after that you'd retire from the Coast Guard, but he's involved a year later during the blizzard of 1978 rescue. Frank was in the newspaper for a different rescue. He saved the life of 10-year-old Michael Almeida. He was on his bicycle, went right off the edge of the pier, and unfortunately his jeans got caught in the bike chain, so the bike was like an anchor, pulled him to the bottom. Frank happened to be on his vessel, maybe 50 yards away, saw what happened, and with his son, they raced over there. Frank dove in, and in his report to the police department, he said, I found that boy at the bottom of the ocean, and I freed his pants from the chain and brought him up, and we revived him, and he made it. So that, of all the people in the book, that's the only one I never found. And at the time, he was 10 years old, and his name was Michael Almeida. So if you know a Michael Almeida, who would be a little older now, tell him I want to talk to him. And back then, the Coast Guard did not have rescue swimmers. So if they had, say, a boat that had capsized and they needed work done on it, or to remove the deceased from the capsized boat, they'd fly Frank out in the helicopter because he was a diver. So I give you that background so that okay, this guy's highly experienced at sea, and although he's not a member of the Coast Guard, he works closely with them because he's always on the water. And so when the storm hits, he's up in Gloucester, safe and sound, no intention of going out. They know the storm's starting to ramp up. But nobody knows, remember back then, nobody knows that this is going to be the storm of the century. The Boston Globe weather report on Sunday called for 6 inches maximum. So this came as a real surprise. But the issue that started the whole thing in motion was happening down in Salem Sound. There was a vessel named the Global Hope, X marks the spot, and it was a Greek oil tanker. There's a picture of it, a real rust bucket. And about 5 p.m. on the radio, all of a sudden you hear, "This is Global Hope, this is Global Hope, our hull is broken, water in the engine room. And the Coast Guard responds, give us more details, your location, what's happening? And the captain just goes, water's coming in. And then click, the radio goes dead. So now the Coast Guard's got a tough call. What's happening with this Global Hope? And where is it exactly? Last location was in Salem Sound. So they have to assume it's still there. And then for me personally, the lucky break was this gentleman here, Warren Andrews. He was a blind radio operator who would assist the traffic in Salem. He would zip from one radio set to another. He hit the record button and recorded all the Marine chatter that happened that night. So you had that distress call from the Global Hope. You have Frank talking to the Coast Guard. You have the Coast Guard boats that went out to try and save the men on the oil tanker. All that is because of Warren Andrews. A little bit about the blizzard. It was actually two low pressure systems that came together to be one big one. And it's heading towards New England. Those lines are the old-fashioned isobars, so where they're close together is where the winds are the strongest. And then when it gets up towards Nantucket, you can see the strongest winds are hitting the Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire coastline. And then what happens is it stalls. So waves are a function of, wind speed, wind duration, and open fetch of the ocean. And all these came together because you had this storm just stalled over the ocean, sending giant waves towards the shore. And if it had a warm core, it would have been called a hurricane. So 5 p.m. is, where the story really starts ramping up because the Global Hope, this is not it, but this is a similar oil tanker in trouble. They've put out that distress call. And the Coast Guard decides, well, we have no radio contact with them. We've got to get boats there, because fresh in their mind is that incident a year earlier, the Chester Poling, where the oil tanker splits in half. So that was just 1 year earlier, in the winter, during a blizzard. So a lot of eerie similarities. And so they send out this big cutter, the Decisive. This is 210 feet. But it's coming all the way from, I believe this was in Provincetown at the time. So it's got to get all the way up to Gloucester, going into these seas coming out of the north. So it's making very slow time. And I was able to find the people that served on that, and they're in the book as well. And a smaller cutter went out. This is the Cape George that we think went over the breakwater. So they're all racing to the oil tanker, but they're just getting beat up because of the size of the waves during the blizzard. So this lighthouse is over 200 feet tall. You could see the waves even after the storm. And the men on the cutter said, we were icing up badly, so that was slowing us even more. And people think I worked in the Coast Guard, but I never did. And I said, so what do you do when your vessel's icing up? And they said, we send a rookie out with a baseball bat. But they said we couldn't do that this night because they'd be swept overboard. It was just so wild. So now the commander at Gloucester has another decision to make. Okay, if these bigger vessels are having trouble getting all the way to Salem Sound, I can't have people die on my watch and us not do anything from Gloucester. So I'm going to send out our 44-foot patrol boat. And here it is. This was a workhorse for the Coast Guard. It's been replaced by their 47 motor lifeboat. But back then, this was a real workhorse. Could take a beating. And believe it or not, this is the skipper, how young he was. I don't even think he shaved yet. And his name was Bob McElroy. So you have 4 young men on board. But, you know, Bob McElroy was a smart guy. He graduated number 2 in his class, and he could get the pick of any assignment. He picked Gloucester, which most people would take Hawaii or someplace like that, but he wanted to be in the action. And the crew members with him, including Bob Crom, here's Bob later when he was in the Marine State Police. Bob, by the way, is probably the strongest guy I ever met, 6'8", solid muscle. But he wasn't afraid to say, Mike, I was scared to death out there. He said, we were just being hammered by enormous waves, and thank God for Bob McElroy at the wheel, because he had memorized the charts. Remember, there is no GPS. So the charts have all gone to mush, and he would say something, you know, like, look out for the B buoy, and Bob Crom said, sure enough, 5 minutes later, we'd see it, and he said one time we could see it, a buoy coming down on us off this wave, almost crushed us like a bug. He said, so we were huddled around the wheel with no illusions that we were really going to do a rescue. It was just way too rough. But he said our orders were to get to Salem Sound and find that oil tanker, so we kept going. Somewhere in this vicinity, or maybe a little closer, they come on the radio, and Bob McElroy, that skipper, goes, we've lost our radar. We've lost our radar. We're not exactly sure where we are. And the commander now is, you know, just got dread. Oh my God, I sent these 4 guys out, and they don't even know where they are, and this storm is just starting to explode. And Frank has been on the radio with the commander. They were good friends, and a couple times Frank would say, I'm standing by on the can-do. I've got, you know, a couple men on board who are familiar with the vessel. If you need us, let us know. And it's about this time that Commander Paradis finally says, okay, Frank, would appreciate it if you'd take a look for them, and because they're lost out there. And the 44, we know for sure that it made it into Salem Sound. And we, again, because they don't have radar, they don't know their exact path. But Salem Sound, I put in a couple of the islands, but it's just filled with shoals and islands. It's one of the most difficult places to navigate. So you don't want to be in there during a storm because you're going to hit one of these rocks. So Frank says, okay, we'll give it a try. We'll give it our best shot, is how he says it. And again, I'm, you know, in the interest of time, I'm skipping things, but to give you the core of the story. So out they go. Here's what the can-do looked like in good weather. On the top is a radar bar, big antenna for their radio, and out they go. And there's 5 on board. So Frank, I'm going to talk a little bit about Charlie Bucko because he's a fascinating person. Don Wilkinson, Dave Curley, Kenny Fuller, all very experienced mariners. So it's not like these guys had no experience at sea and didn't know what they were getting into. They didn't know they were going into the storm of the century, but they knew it was going to be dangerous. Frank told them this was going to be very dangerous, but they all had experience. For example, Don Wilkinson, he operated speedboats and would raise money for the Glaucoma Foundation. Dave Curley, he had his own motorboat up there in Gloucester, so he was very familiar with those waters. And Kenny Fuller was a commercial fisherman, so he was used to being out at sea in the winter, you know, for days at a time. But the most interesting of the group was the youngest, Charlie Bucko. So Charlie is like something out of central casting, from Hollywood. This good-looking guy who served in the Marines, 2 Purple Hearts in Vietnam, and I write about the battles he was in Vietnam, what happened to him, and when the second time he's wounded, they say, that's enough, you're done. And he comes back to the States, and he's not sure what he do next. He tries a little bit of everything. He was a real free spirit. He did a little bit of acting. He was a cowboy for a while. He worked at a cattle ranch. And then one day he shows up at his sister's apartment in San Francisco, and they're talking. She's like, well, what are you going to do with your life next? And he goes, well, I've always wanted to see Antarctica. And Janice goes, Charlie, you don't even have a nickel to your name. And sure enough, he finds a way to get to Antarctica. And the way he does it is he joins the Coast Guard, wrangles his way somehow onto an icebreaker, and sends her a picture of him with the icebergs. And then later gets transferred to Massachusetts, and he's a small boat operator, the 44-footer, and is involved in several rescues. But being a free spirit, there was one incident where, I can't remember what it was he did, but the commander of station, I think it was Point Allerton, said, okay, Charlie, for that infraction, here's a toothbrush, start scrubbing the brass on this vessel. And later that commander started getting on Charlie, and he called all the men together, and he tried to make an example out of Charlie, and he goes, so now what do you have to say for yourself, bucko? And Charlie steps up and he slugs the officer. Now, normally you do that in the Coast Guard, especially today's Coast Guard, you'd be finished, you'd be in the brig. He did go in the brig, but a couple senior guys speak up on his behalf and say, he's already done 3 major rescues and he's the coolest guy of the bunch. We'll take him in Gloucester. Maybe it was because he fought in Vietnam that he was able to stay cool. And so Point Allerton goes, yeah, just get him out of here. So that's how he ends up in Gloucester. But at the time of the blizzard of 78, he had just left the Coast Guard because he and Sharon, who you'll meet, are going to get married and have a family. So he lets his hair grow long, and he grows a mustache, and he's working at the Marine Railway Station. He had been involved in the Chester Poling rescue, but now he's retired. But Frank, right before they left to go, help the Coast Guard during the blizzard of 78, he calls Charlie, and he goes, Charlie, I could use you on the boat. The 44-footer's in trouble, and Charlie knows who those guys are because he trained them. And so Sharon's telling Charlie, don't go, you're out of the Coast Guard. That's the reason you left. And he goes, I have to go. I trained those guys, and they're in trouble. So he gets on the boat. And this storm along the coastline, people tend to remember it for the snow. And here on Cape Cod, the destruction wasn't quite as bad as some of those communities like Scituate and Revere, but whole houses were just torn off their foundation. Here's one where the second floor is blown partly off the first floor. And these were some of those grand beachfront homes down in Scituate before the storm and then after. And you're wondering, why is that one still standing? But if I go back, it's the second story of the middle house that's fallen down. The first floor is gone. So it gives you an idea of what these men were up against with the waves. And then that Manomet section of Plymouth, look at the erosion right up to the foundation. So as an author, I thought, why hasn't this story been told? I didn't come across it until I think it was the 1990s. And the reason was all the headlines were about, thousands trapped in their car. Whereas if this incident happened today with the Can-Do, it would be headlines in the Boston Globe. But the bigger story was so many people trapped on 128 and 95, and then this massive cleanup. So that was the lucky break of why nobody had bothered to do a book about this. Ships just tossed a block inland. And look at these waves just coming over the seawalls. There's a story in the book, because it's happening simultaneous to Frank going out. Probably the hardest interview I ever did, where Sally Lanzakos is in her house down in Scituate, similar to this situation where water's flooded all around it. It's starting to come into the house. She calls the fire department. They come in a little boat like this because this lake is forming in the neighborhood because the seawater's coming over the seawall. And they get Sally and her daughter, and then they get Mr. and Mrs. Hart in the boat, and they're all heading to high ground when suddenly a section of the seawall breaks. So if you can imagine, that lake that formed in the neighborhood now wants to go back to the ocean, but it's like a raging river. And it takes the boat with it. And that chapter in the book is about who makes it and who doesn't. And they end up in the frozen waters of Scituate Harbor here. So 10 p.m., Frank is banging his way down to Salem Sound. The 44-footer, Bob, young Bob, is on the radio saying, we still don't know where we are, we don't have radar. And then on the 44, they suddenly go, we've lost engine power. And that's usually the kiss of death, because you're going to go, broach, you're going to be sideways to the seas. So you hear on the radio, Commander Paradis back in Gloucester go, drop your hook, meaning drop your anchor. And you hear McElvride go, yes, sir. But when I found Bob McElvride, he had relocated to Canada. It was really hard to find. But we met, and I said, Bob, I know for a fact you didn't drop your anchor. Why did you lie? And he said, Mike, there was no way we were going to drop anchor in that storm, because we knew that'd probably be the end of us. Paradis, being back at the station, probably had no idea just how bad it was. He said, so we lied because we weren't in any position to argue with him, and we decided to gamble and try to get the engine back. And that gamble eventually paid off. So it was a tough call what to do. They think they hit a ledge somewhere where I've got that arrow there. And you could see how close we think the Global Hope was. I said, did you ever see the oil tanker? They said, Mike, you couldn't see 10 feet in front of you. Snow, sleet was coming down sideways. Waves are crashing all over the boat. And in a strange coincidence, on the 44, they come back on the radio and they go, we've got our engine back, we've got engine power, heading towards Beverly. Just 2 minutes later, all of a sudden, Frank comes on the radio. And, he's still out at sea trying to get down there. And he explains that they're in trouble now. So you have 3 boats in trouble. And so this is what he said. I'm going to try to imitate his voice as best I can. He goes to Mike Parody, Mike, I have to turn around. My radar went out for some reason, plus the AM antenna. That went overboard with a big crash. So if I can get turned around, it'll be a while getting back. I've got nothing to work with. And so his voice is kind of matter of fact, but he knows this is really serious. Because there's nothing else. Without radar, you could get washed into those granite shorelines. You could get, hit on a shoal, capsize. So he tries that only maneuver he can do, which is get to the safety of Gloucester Harbor, a deep port. And we do think, now I work closely with his son because his son used to work on the Can-Do with his father, so he knew the boat like the back of his hand. Both of us came to the conclusion, yep, they probably did make that turn successfully, which would be very difficult in the blizzard. But while they think they're going forward in the storm, we think, one step forward, two back when these big waves are pushing the vessel backwards. So, while we can't be precise about all of the locations, we both came to the same conclusion independently and then talked. So we think they're actually being pushed backwards, but they think they're getting close to Gloucester Harbor and safety. And the reason we think that is that the next clue is coming up, and that was right around just before midnight. And all of a sudden, all night long, it's been Frank on the radio, and now all of a sudden, it's Charlie Bucko on the radio. And he just goes, it gives me goosebumps thinking about it, hearing it on that tape. A mayday, a mayday, a mayday. This is not a drill. This is the Can-Do. And you hear parodies go, where are you, Can-Do? And Charlie goes, action extremely violent. Be advised we're in shoal water. We might have hit the breakwater, meaning, that big dog bar breakwater there at Gloucester Harbor. Then a little later he must think about it. He goes, negative, negative on my last. And Parodies goes, well, where do you think you are? And he goes, we don't know. We haven't had any radar to work with. We're just taking a beating. And a little later you realize they've lost the entire windshield on the Can-Do. And on the windshield was this spinning window that would go round and round and flick the ice off. That came in and hit Frank, so that's why Charlie's taken over control of the boat. And, you're learning this in bits and pieces of what's happening. And the toughest part for the families is they all have marine radios at home, so they're hearing this live. Or they have police scanners, and all of a sudden they're hearing the police chatter. So that was the worst part. And Frank's daughter said, I just finally, because my mom was listening to all this, unplugged the radio and said, we got to stop. And she's like, Dad's been in a million rescues, he'll be fine. But deep inside, they know this storm is different. And Charlie's fiance, Sharon, is listening to the police scanner, and she knows, she tried to talk him out of it, that he's out there and in trouble. So friends of Frank's on shore hear this, and they say, we got to do something. So they get in their Jeep, and they start going down the coast, and on their CB radio, trying to raise the Can-Do. And Guard Estes, he's passed away. He was a great person to work with. He said, believe it or not, Mike, down in Manchester, we picked up the Can-Do, and Frank was back on the radio, and he said, the boys have got me patched up. He had part of his face sliced. And he said, we still don't know where we are. And so Guard said, we're down by the tennis club in Manchester with the sandy beach. We're going to get other cars to shine their headlights out to sea. And if you see the headlights, just ride your boat right up to that sandy shore. You won't hit granite and capsize. But Frank never sees the headlights. And Guard actually, there are a couple funny stories to break the tension. He said, I was on that deck there where the Jeep was down below shining the headlights out to sea, and a big wave came, and it took out the front of the deck, and it carried me and another man off the deck. And he said, I was able to hang on to something, but it took this other guy right out to sea. And he said, but then the next wave deposited him right next to me. He said, like at my feet. He said, so I dragged him to high ground. And I said to Guard, I said, so then what happened? He said, well, he's probably still running to Omaha. It's like that it's a 1 in a million that the sea would deposit him, and he's half conscious, and Guard would drag him out of there. So the Coast Guard is pitting all their hopes now to help the tanker, the 44-footer, and the can-do on the bigger cutters. But they're not doing well. And so this is what the commander of the Cape George says. And I'll try to imitate his voice. Station Gloucester, Cutter Cape George, that's affirmative. We are presently lost. I repeat, we are lost. We are 2.5 miles of eastern point, but cannot confirm it. Proceeding toward shore. And that's really dangerous, proceeding toward shore blind. You'll be crunched like a tin can. So they're in big trouble. Every single person on the Cape George said, we thought that was our last moments on Earth. They said the vessel was so far down, the antennas were underwater at times. And then a little later, Frank's back on the radio with Commander Paradis back at Gloucester, and he says, we've dropped anchor. And he doesn't explain who did it. And on this model of the can-do, you see that someone would have had to leave the safety of the pilot house and go out on that ice-covered deck and chip out that anchor and throw it overboard. And we're pretty sure it was Charlie who did it because of some clues later in the story. But amazing he pulled it off. And we know for a fact that he did get back on the boat. So that bought them time because they had lost engine power. I forgot to mention that a little earlier. So they're sitting ducks to capsize. So they really didn't have a choice but to drop anchor. And again, nobody knows for sure exactly where they are. And then at 1:45, and again, I'm skipping parts, but to keep this under an hour, at 1:45 a.m., you just hear Paradis on the radio going, can-do, come in, can-do, come in, and no answer. So the first time I listened to the tapes, I'm like, oh, God, it's all over. But then this private radio operator named Mel Cole, he can hear them, so he breaks in from his home up in Beverly Farms and says, I can hear the can-do. And so Paradis said, okay, you be the go-between. Tell me what they're saying. I'll give advice back. And it was interesting. I always wondered why Mel could hear him with his home radio, and the Coast Guard, who's supposedly got the best equipment, couldn't. And when I asked him, he was vague, and Mel passed away maybe 4 years ago. And when I went to the funeral, I saw in the obituary that Mel did some work with radios for the CIA. So that's why his radio was so strong. And he had this great radio set. It was down in his basement. So he's the final voice talking to Frank on the radio. And Mel thinks that he could hear them because he had a direct beam, and he thinks they were just south of Baker's Island. That's that island in the middle of the screen. And that coincides with what the captain's son thinks as well, that they dropped anchor in what is called the Gooseberry Shoals. So Tuesday morning, though, probably say 3 a.m., even Mel Cole can't hear the can-do, so there is no communication. And the chatter is, we got to find them, we got to find them. So they asked the lighthouse keeper at Baker's Island to walk the perimeter of the island, even though it's still snowing that next morning, see if there's debris from the can-do or any sign of it. And he gets back on the radio and says, negative. The Cape George does make it to Gloucester. They didn't have any contact with the Can-Do. Again, they're lucky to be alive. And then a gentleman from Cape Cod here, from Sandwich, who was in the Coast Guard, he launched to try and find the Can-Do that next day. But his name was Brian Wallace. He said, when we went up, he said, we were, say, over at Boston Harbor, the whole nose of the helo back then was covered with ice. We had to abort. We gave it our best shot, but we had to abort the mission because remember, it snowed for 2 days. So now we're into Tuesday evening. That, nobody knows what's happened, and then finally, the Decisive goes in and they find the Global Hope. It had not split in half. It was still in Salem Sound. Yes, it was taking on water, but probably not in a Mayday situation that they made it sound with that distress call. They had no power. They were cold, but all 33 men were safe. And I have interviewed the man from the Atlantic Strike Team, the first one, helicopter down to it. And he said, I was just furious because I knew that there were probably lives lost because of this rust bucket and then their premature distress call. And it was on Wednesday morning that they're starting to find a couple life rings from the Can-Do and then a couple bodies and then more bodies, but not Charlie Bucko's. So Sharon is screaming at Mike Paradis, you haven't found the vessel and you haven't found Charlie. He could still be alive. And Paradis tells her, there's no way, and she goes, of course he could be. He's been through everything. He's been, wounded twice in Vietnam. But 8 days later, the Coast Guard, they abandon the search. They can't find the vessel. They assume it's at the bottom of the ocean with Charlie Bucko still on board. But friends of Frank, they hire their own plane to do a search. And they said, we focused a little bit more south of where the Coast Guard did. We were focusing roughly Baker's Island south, all the way down past Marblehead. And in that little plane, they said it was just south of Marblehead off Tinker's Island that we saw something in the water. And it turned out to be the Can-Do. So I won't give away everything that happens with this discovery, but to give you an idea, this is now, I'm jumping ahead 3 years later, when they finally raised the Can-Do from the bottom of the ocean, this is what it looked like. So everything was gone, superstructure, you could see the stanchions are bent over, so it led me to believe that it had rolled on the bottom of the ocean down to Marblehead, that the anchor line broke at some point, the chain, and just rolled on the bottom of the sea. There's a big gash in the bow there. And this, raising the vessel even this 2 or 3 years later, this has an impact on the story as well. It creates a whole another series of events. But in closing, I don't like to think of the boat this way. I like to think of it the way it was, and Frank's words when he went out, he said to Mike Paradis, okay, we'll give it our best shot, and that's what they did. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So that's why it was so important to put in the rescue of the Chester Poling a year earlier in a blizzard, splits in half. Frank's involved, successful rescue. It kind of makes you see that people had experience doing this. The big difference is the Chester Poling rescue was during the daytime. The 10 hours rescue was at night. Everything's multiplied, so much more difficult. Questions or comments?
Thank you for your
Thank you.
presentation. I love the book. I was wondering if you could share with us the technique you use to tell these adventure stories. You tell a story within a story within a story, a sub-story within a story. There's a technical name for that, framing.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I didn't know what I was doing.
Even if not, it would be like flowchart, actually fatal forecasts to try to keep track
Yeah.
of the thing. How do you keep track of each of the characters and then know when to bring a sub-story in to help modify, explain, let's say, in this case, Frank,
Right.
in the can-do.
Right.
Does it come out of your mind just naturally, or have you developed a framing technique or a flow chart or Venn diagrams?
Not really the framing or the flow chart, but what I do is, when you start a project, it's so overwhelming. And I can't tell you how many people I've met who've started books and given up, and I'm like, why? And they go, it's just overwhelming. I go, I know, but try this technique. Just look at one chapter as your book. And then when you get done with that chapter, celebrate. So just bang out the first chapter once you've done the research. You're going to go back and change it later. And so I use old-fashioned files with all sorts of notes inside, but they're by topic, and then those topics are arranged by how I think the chapters are going to flow. So I'm doing one now. I like to alternate between fun books like The Power of Positive Fishing and then a serious book like this. So it's time to do a serious book. I'm doing one where 3 men are on a vessel in the Gulf, it sinks, and they're out there for a long time fighting off sharks. And it just feels overwhelming because there's so many people to interview, the people involved in the rescue, their family members. But I keep going, just focus on that first chapter. Don't worry about that. Yeah. And then it just kind of flows because you are following a chronological order. I personally don't like reading books that hop around in chronology. I like the flow.
Very good,
Thank you. Yep, there was another question. Yes.
Yeah, what happened to the Coast Guard 41-footer?
So the 41-footer, they take that gamble and lie. They don't drop their anchor. They do get their engine power back. And then a little later at night, after Frank's in big trouble, you hear them say, part of our radar looks like it's back. We think we see Beverly. And they made it to Beverly. And then they hear Frank went out to save their lives, so they want to go save his. But their prop was damaged. The boat was damaged. They couldn't go.
When they found 3 years later the can-do, did they ever find any remains of Charlie?
I don't want to give the story away. Good question. I won't give it away just yet how it all turns out. Other comments? But I was so worried family members would not talk to me, and you hate to even bring up, such a tragic subject. But it's not like that. They want the story to get out, and they want it to be accurate, because a lot of times in the newspaper it's so short, it misleads people. I would hear rumors in Gloucester, they were all drunk on the can-do. It's like, I interviewed people they were at the marina, and they said, as soon as they announced the storm, Frank was just kind of in rescue mode, thinking another storm, I may need to help the Coast Guard. This is, it's in his DNA. Other questions or comments?
This is softball. Where were you during the Blizzard?
That is the only winter I missed in New England, and I was in Chicago freezing my butt off. So I would hear about this blizzard, and I would think, everybody's exaggerating. And then I saw the pictures. Yeah, you imagined it. You had a question over here? Yes.
I just wanted to thank Judy because she didn't introduce herself. Judy Warren, and she frankly is hired.
Yeah. It, you know,
To do, it was fun to do, I enjoyed doing it.
it's people like Judy and Arthur and Anne that makes this crazy job of being a writer worth it. It's the people you meet through it, like Frank's son. We've stayed in touch all these years and still get together. Yes?
So you mentioned how, in some ways, the town is starting to overlap.
Yeah.
How do you do the research for no-out stories?
How did I do that?
How do you do the research for the more no-out stories?
Oh, so that's a combination of the eyewitnesses who were there, such as William Bradford and Winslow, but interviewing Native Americans as well, their oral history. So until I Have No Country, like now, I don't think publishers would do that book because it'd be like, you're not Native American, you can't do it. So everything's changed. So the publisher who took a gamble on Ochala and the Pilgrim, it really was a gamble. Because other publishers said, we love the story you wrote, but that's kind of a no-no these days. And I'm like, I work with the Native American community, but yeah, it's a whole different ballgame. Yeah.
But also, you have the second King Philip book, which is a historical review, the one you do with Eric Schultz.
Yes, and Eric, I learned if you're going to co-author a book, one person needs to be the lead, and Eric, I have to say, did 90% of that book. He was brilliant. And I was more like the agent, adding the maps, finding a good publisher, adding some eyewitness diaries to the back of it. That was one of those co-author relationships that worked perfectly. And he was so modest, and when I read his draft, I was blown away, going, this is really good, better than mine. Because I had done one too, and we used mostly his. Then later I find out, he was the CEO of a big high-tech company. But he was so modest, he never brought that up. He goes, I'm struggling, no one will publish my book. And I'm like, you're kidding me, this is incredible. So now that book's been in print now usually a book stays in print 5 years. 25 years later, still going strong. Yeah. So publishers, they don't have all the answers. Yes?
Do you get to stay in touch with some of the main characters of the books? I was introduced to your work with A Storm Too Soon.
Yes.
You did a presentation at the High End Shot Club and had fabulous photographs of that storm. And I had flown for many years on a Beneteau 37. So I
right.
seized on the book and everything about it. But I wondered if, just even from that one book, would you...
Yes. So for example, it oftentimes leads to something really magical. JP, the lead character who survived, he's a dual citizen of the U.S. and France. He said, come to France. And I said, can I bring my daughter? And Kristen was probably 19 at the time. And he said, absolutely. So it was great. He had this chateau, like an old castle, way out in the middle of nowhere. We stayed there for close to a week and had a ball. So yeah, you do stay in touch with these people. Fatal Forecast that the book group has read. Ernie Hazard, the lead character. I just surprised him with the young adult edition and sent him a bunch of copies. I said, show people what courage is. Kids need to see that it's in all of us. And so I stay in touch with Ernie too. Yeah.
What criteria do you regard it as the storm of the century? The damage done on the coast?
Yeah, they call it it's definitely the blizzard of the century. The only one that came close to it in my research was 1888. There was a massive blizzard here in New England. But yeah, the damage was just off the charts. Who was really helpful with the research too was Michael Dukakis. I had no connection to him, but back when I did the book, he was very gracious, and I asked him about that sweater that he wore. He said, it was sweaters. The state police would bring me a new one each day, and he said it was just luck that I was at the WBZ studios because I was doing an interview there when the storm started to ramp up, and I figured I better better stay. Yeah, yeah. He said his main goal was to keep one runway open at the airport, knowing we're going to need transport planes to fly in with supplies and with front-end loaders to move this snow. So yeah, he was very gracious. He endorsed the back of the book when it came out, so that was really nice. Well, I hope you come up and take a look at the different titles, and thank you so much for having me. Thank you. Thank you.